For today's podcast, we're going to focus on the concept of the chosen, as in God's chosen people. And if you're following along with both series of my podcast during this year, you know that the beginning of every week, I'm attempting to post a podcast that is topical, and in the midweek and towards the end of the week, I am doing different books of the Bible. So we kind of have two things going on simultaneously on my podcast during this year. And if you are following both series, the series of podcasts on the books of the Bible, you know that so far in 2025 we have completed the Old Testament. So I do have a podcast episode on every book of the Old Testament at this point that you can find and watch. And one of the common things that we have come up with as we one of the common themes that have precipitated from this closer look at the Old Testament is the importance of knowing and understanding that when we read the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, we are reading the story of a singular group of people. And the story we're reading is the story that is told by members of that particular group of people. And while I don't want to go so far as to say they're lying sometimes, although some of their people did lie, what we have here is a story of their perception of how things were. So, in many cases, it's their perception of truth, their perceptions about God, their perceptions about what God asked them to do, what God gave to them, and what God took away from them. Now, when we get into the New Testament, like we will the rest of this year, we will see that that was the whole purpose and point of Jesus coming, was to clarify to the people, you've missed the boat on so many levels. So you can truly be a follower of the life and lessons of Jesus, and at the same time recognize that the people of the Old Testament had some false beliefs, and some of the writings in the Old Testament, while they are truths about what those people at that time believed. And it's okay for us to look at things that they believed and say, yeah, they weren't right. Because that's exactly what Jesus did when he came. He pointed out their hypocrisy and where they were missing the point. And I think it's perfectly okay for us to do that. And pointing out flaws within the people, and within taking the Old Testament at face value without acknowledging that these people are writing what they knew and understand at that time. And it's okay to know that they had flaws. And so some of the things written in the Old Testament are going to be indicative of their flaws and their misunderstandings. And that's okay. That's not attacking Christianity at all. In fact, it's actually supporting Christianity, because that's kind of the point. And we get into parallel situations today when we have modern day Christians and Christian denominations that are doing the same thing. They're calling themselves God's chosen people. God loves us more than them. And that's not the way God works. That's not the way God works. God is a God of love, and we need to be focused on God's love and doing that which God has asked us to do. And Jesus clarified that perfectly, and there's no reason to argue about that. Jesus clarified that perfectly. Love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, mind, spirit, your talents, your time, your resources. And you do that by loving your neighbors as yourself. And everyone is your neighbor. Your family is your neighbor. Your enemies are your neighbors, and all of that. And following those two things is the pinnacle of what we need to do. And all of our other little rules or rules we think we have all depend on those two. And if you do those two things, you're all right, and you're doing what you need to do. And churches and denomination and offshoot theologies that want to create all these other hurdles to jump through in order to prove yourself worthy of God are just wrong. They're missing the boat, and that's not what it's all about. And we go back to Abraham and Abraham having the story where God spoke to him, and he was looking out over this land. This land I give to you, you and your family, and you will be nations out here, and this will be your land. Now, that may have been God's promise, and that is a promise that came true. Abraham's family did settle in that area, and we have to know and understand at that time there were some skirmishes with other peoples, but it was over land and water and resources. And it was quite possible for Abraham to come in, and early on, Abraham went in. There's big open spaces. Let's set up here. This is where we're going to live. And that was fine. People didn't argue about that. The problem came is when you wanted what someone else had, which kind of sounds like, that 10th commandment about coveting. Oh, I want what they've got. It looks better. And so that's where you're getting into problem. And a couple thousand years later, about 1,500 years later, when Jesus came, he said, instead of focusing on these 10 commandments, let's focus on these two things: loving the Lord your God and loving all people. If you love all people, you're not going to move into new territory and take the land away from people that already live there. And you can't claim that God told you to go in and kill these people, that it's your destiny to have this land, because God would not do that. God would not do that. God did not tell Joshua to go in and kill the people in Canaan. God did not tell Joshua to go in and wipe out Jericho. Now, I understand that's a very difficult thing to say. It's a very difficult thing to know and understand, because we've been indoctrinated as young little children in Sunday school about these stories, and these stories are very precious and very dear to us. But we have to understand that the root of these stories is telling us about this group of people that led to the need for Jesus to come to clarify where they got it wrong. Isn't there a commandment about thou shalt not kill? I don't remember that says thou shalt not kill unless your priest and your teacher and your prophet told you that God told you to go in and kill those people and take away their land, because I'm giving this to you because you are my chosen people and I think you're better than them, so I'm going to gift you with that. If you're irritated with me right now because you think I'm just saying all these terrible things and I'm attacking the Bible, no, I'm not. If you feel that way, you might need to readjust your own thinking and think about, what do you know about the Bible? Has the Bible become your idol? Have these old stories in the Old Testament become your idol? Is that what you worship? Or do you worship the life and lessons of Jesus that came and told us what to do? And one of the most important stories that Jesus told was when he's talking about separating the sheep and the goats from the end, and then getting up and said, when you have not done this to the least of these, then you've not done it for me. Therefore, I do not know you. Go away. And we Jesus was murdered while we had this great big glorious Jesus is this great sacrifice. We can't gloss over the fact that Jesus was murdered. And Jesus was murdered by the religious institutions who used their political structures to get the job done so they could finagle this loophole on getting this murder done. And they did this because Jesus challenged their religious rules and their theology. Same exact thing is happening right now. Next week's podcast is on inclusion and exclusion. And these two podcasts are going to go together really well right at this point, because that's where we are today, where we have good Christian people and good Christian denominations that have actually changed some of their theologies and have become more inclusive, which is what we're supposed to do. This comes directly from the life and lessons and ministry of Jesus. You have to be inclusive and loving. Whatever you've done to the least of these, those that everybody else has rejected, then that's as if you've done it unto God. So that's really what it's about, people. But when we're talking about the chosen people, you know, we've had a huge conflict going on in Israel right now. Again, Israel, that land has been in conflict for thousands of years. And there's a conflict there going on now. And right now, Israel has become the bad man again. They're killing people. They're starving them to death so that they don't have to drop bombs on them anymore. And it's just a really, really terrible thing. Now, when that first started, Hamas we kind of say Hamas started it, but Israel had been doing some bad things to those people already, and Hamas overreacted and committed terrible, terrible things. Hamas did very, very bad things. Yes, I know that. They may have felt pushed and trapped into that because Israel was able to still do terrible, terrible things to their people. I'm not saying that Hamas was right. Don't get me wrong, because I'm not, because Hamas was in the wrong. Hamas launched this terrible, 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 out of control situation that's going on. And when that first started, I had lots of questions, and I wanted to know more about that land, and I wanted to know and understand more about why are these Palestinian people pushed away. That land was called Palestine for a long, long, long time. So why all of a sudden there's no longer a country called Palestine? Now, I do realize that some nations still recognize that Palestine is a nation. When that was under British control, it was called Palestine. It was. And actually, when Britain was in charge, they started putting limitations on how many Jews could immigrate back into that area, because they recognized it was going to be a problem. And finally, when they recognized this problem, it can't be solved any longer, Britain gave up control of that area and just withdrew. And I wanted to know more and more about that. And so I actually did some research. I actually wrote a book. It's no longer in print, but I titled it Canaan, the land of Israel and Palestine, because at this point I'm talking about the land where these two groups of people live. And, I've heard the argument as well, it was Israel first. And then Palestine will say, no, it was Palestine first. And we have, I started out talking about the story of Moses and the people coming back from being captured in Egypt and coming back in, and their 40 days of wandering around. And then finally, Joshua takes them in and says, God gave us this land. And they go in and they wipe out the people of Jericho. There is no way that was of God. I don't care what the Old Testament reads when you read that story, because we're hearing that from someone of that group telling their story. They're justifying murdering all those people, just like Israel is justifying murdering all the Palestinian people. Yeah, Hamas did some terrible things. Yes, they did need to wipe out Hamas. But wiping out Hamas or wiping out a whole group of people, that's two different things. And they're not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. But anyway, this book is no longer in print. And in fact, as I was looking in this book for a particular little list that I remembered writing, and I put lots of maps here, and I go through the whole history of that land. There's a lot of good information in here telling you about this. And the book is out of print. It doesn't need to be back into print, because when I finished writing this, it was still early on in this war, and Israel was going overboard at the time I wrote this, and I called them out for that. But I still tried to remain a little neutral in this, because I wanted this to be the history of the land. I really wasn't neutral, and I'm certainly not neutral now. And so if this book was to go back into print, I would have to write a few paragraphs right at the end and say, since this book was originally published, as of this date, this is what Israel has done. And I condemn Israel completely for what they have done. In fact, one of my chapters was keeping score. I kept score of the people, giving positive and negative points based on the things that happened to the Israelites, to the other people, and against the Israelites and against the other people. And so I kind of kept score. Okay, let's numerize this and keep score and see who's right and who's wrong. And let me see, how did that turn out? I mean, the score would not be the same now, because Israel would grant hundreds of points to the others. Okay, so at the time I did this, going back through thousands of years of history, Israel scored 15 points and Palestine scored 18 points on this made up system that I created. So even in this, I gave the victory to Palestine as far as who is more right, even though a score of 15-18. But since the publishing of this book, there's a lot of things I would do differently. Anyway, I would, my memory's not as good as it used to be, but I really researched this area quite a bit. And then I thought, wow, I've got all this research. Let me organize it. Organize that, poof, and then it became a book. And one of the things, I am quite proud of several of my books. But when we talk about this land, let's get back into this land of Palestine, and we get into this whole idea of God's chosen people. Americans think they're God's chosen people now. The Republicans think they're God's chosen people now. However, there's nothing Christian about them. So if we really believe the God of the Old Testament still operated today as the people depicted in the stories we have about the people in the Old Testament, then God would be sending a plague that only affected Republicans. The Republicans that are in charge, that are doing all these things, and their hypocrisy. I don't know, like their ears would fall off, their nose would turn purple with blue polka dots, so we'd know who they are. God would mark them for us. But okay, So when we're looking at this land and we're talking about these people, they weren't really different people. The people of Israel and Palestine are related. Now we're looking like thousands of years later, so they're very distantly related to each other, but they're still related. And when we look in the Old Testament and these people going in and wiping out these other people, they're wiping out their relatives, you know? I often think about, you know, Jacob, who became Israel, which then turned into the Israelites, and now the country of Israel. Although all of those people that claim to be Israelites probably don't have any more original Israeli blood in them than any of the other people in that area. But as we get into that whole story about them going to Egypt because there was a great famine, and so they all went there. And I'm thinking, okay, let's not forget that Jacob, Israel, was a twin, and his brother Esau. His brother Esau didn't go to Egypt. Their family didn't become slaves. In fact, if you're looking at the map of the Old Testament times, Esau was Edom. So the country or the region or the people known as the Edomites were the descendants of Esau. When we look at the other people that were living in that area, okay, if you believe the stories of the Old Testament as exact, then we have to go back to Noah and the flood. And the story in the Bible says every person on the entire planet died in this great flood that covered the entire planet. And that left Noah's sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So that would mean all of the people then would be descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So when these Israelites came out of Egypt and they came in and they wiped out the people that lived in Jericho, then they were killing some of their family. Because they all would have been descendants of Noah. True? Anyway, and so there is one section in this book where I talk about Abraham, and I'm going to read one paragraph and this little list I made of these peoples. Abraham's sons, according to biblical records, were Ishmael, Isaac, Zimron, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Now, we all know about Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac because those are the Sunday school stories. The Sunday school stories don't include Abraham's other wives, which there were some. In his older age, he married and had a bunch more kids. And you may have heard that name Midian. You've probably heard about the Midianites. So when you read the Bible stories and they're having trouble with the Midianites, and the Midianites are presented as bad people. Wait a minute. Midian and Isaac were half brothers. They had the same dad, Abraham. They had different mothers. So we're talking about the same peoples, okay? All right, let's read on a little bit. When understanding the peoples of the Middle East, it is important to know and understand the ancestry of the groups of peoples. When reading and studying the conflicts among the people in the biblical records, it is important to comprehend that these groups of people were related to each other. All of the people that battled with the Hebrew people in the Bible were descendants of Noah's three sons, and many of them Later conflicts were between and among the descendants of Abraham's grandsons. So directly into the conflicts we read about in the Old Testament, these are about problems with Abraham's grandsons. Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites were the family of Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham. The Israelites, the family of Jacob, son of Isaac, a grandson of Abraham. The Edomites, the family of Esau, son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham. Amalekites, the family of Amalek, a grandson of Esau. The Kenizzites, the family of Kenaz, a grandson of Esau. The Midianites, the family of Midian, a son of Abraham. The Assyrians, the family of Dedan, son of Jokshan, who was a grandson of Abraham. Asherites, Letushites, Leumanites, the families of Dedan, son of Jokshan, grandson of Abraham. So Dedan, a son of Jokshan, who was also a grandson of Abraham, was the father of all of these other communities, the Assyrians, the Asherites, the Letushites, and the Leumites. The Bani Zomanes, they are the family of Zimran, son of Abraham. And if you look at the maps or in the Bible, you will read about these groups of people. Some of them aren't mentioned very much, like this one. Let's not forget the Moabites and the Ammonites, which are mentioned lots and lots of times. And they're listed like the evil people or outsiders or foreigners. The Moabites. Moab was Lot's son and his grandson. Remember, Lot's daughters slept with their dad, got him drunk because they didn't have any children. So Moab was both Lot's son and his grandson from his eldest living daughter after Sodom was destroyed. King David's great-grandmother was Ruth the Moabite. And when you read that story of Ruth, it says like she was a foreigner. Well, no, she wasn't really. She was a descendant of Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham. So they're really the same family. The Ammonites. Ben-Ami was Lot's son and grandson from Lot's youngest living daughter post Sodom's destruction. So when you read about the Ammonite, it's the same thing. Okay, and then I get into the 12 tribes of Israel that kind of all spread around. And then we have the 12 tribes of Ishmael. And yes, Abraham's promise, as recorded in the Old Testament, the belief that God promised that Abraham would be a father of many nations, that's true. That's true. And I would posit that the war between Israel and Gaza right now, because it's not a war between Israel and Hamas anymore. It may have started out that way, but now it is a war between Israel and Gaza, and it's really a war between Israel and Arab nations that will engage, because Israel is not just focused on Gaza or Palestine anymore. They've kind of gone kookaboo on us here. But when we're looking at this, it gets all the way back to the Israelites separating themselves from all the other people who basically are the ancestors of many of the Arab nations that are there now. So it's really a war between Israel and the Arab people, because Israel declared that they're not like those people, we're something better. And it's kind of that way now. Now we do know that the Jews were all pushed out of that area, and a lot of them ended up in Germany thinking that was safe, and we know about the extermination there. But why would this nation of people who learned from that go back and then do that to another group of people? That's just not right. Okay, so when we're talking about this concept of God's chosen people, we need to know that this concept does not come from God, but is a human construct from a group of people who declared that they were God's chosen people, and they used that in order to perpetuate crimes against God upon other people. And that is clarified for us perfectly well through the life and ministry of Jesus, and especially when Jesus talks about whatever you've done for the least of these, that's what you've done for me. And whatever you have not done, you've not done that for me. Get on out of here. I know you not. You are not with me if you do that sort of thing. So it's possible to follow the life and lessons of Jesus and at the same time realize that some of the stories that we read in the Old Testament of Old Testament people telling us their story might have some wrong information in it. Do I believe the writers of the Old Testament were liars? Some of them, yeah. Mostly, no. I believe they were writing what they really thought and believed. I think they were extremely flawed in what they did. I think the military power of many nations, even today, are extremely flawed in what they do and their beliefs about what they can get away with. Okay, this has been my talk on The Chosen. I'm not talking about the TV series, The Chosen, although I talk about that a lot. The Chosen, when I'm talking about The Chosen, I'm talking about this chosen people of God, which isn't really what this book is about. This is not in print, by the way. You can't get a copy. But if you're interested, I can send you a PDF version. I don't know if I've created a PDF version of that, but I certainly could, and I could make that readily available for free to anyone who wants to read it. It's one of those books that never came out in as an ebook because of all of the charts and the graphs and the maps. They don't work so well on ebook. So we didn't even bother to make that one ebook. But thank you for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. That really helps out with the algorithms on YouTube. Doesn't cost you anything, but it does help me out. Be sure to like and share. Catch you on the next one.